Joshua, should we start by talking about the historical origins of this Japanese interest in cuteness? Because it actually goes back a surprisingly long way, doesn't it?
It does. I can trace cuteness back in the arts in Japan at least 1,000 years, which is really earlier than other countries. And this is in major artworks that are incredibly well known. And interestingly enough, one of the biggest ones was written by women. Because in the Heian period in Japan, 1,000 years ago, women had a really large role in literary production with a lot of famous authors. So there was a book written by Sei Shonagon, who was an attendant to the empress in the imperial court. And it's called The Pillow Book. And you might have heard of it. It's been a movie and various adaptations. It includes a lot of lists of things, like occasions when time drags by, for example. And in the book is a list of adorable things. And this is the first articulation of an aesthetic of cuteness that I can find in any language. And it's remarkably complete. Like, she runs through all of these things that could be considered adorable, even though the word for cute, which is kawaii in Japanese, it didn't exist then. She used a different word that meant more like a certain kind of affection. But all the things in the list are things that we would recognize as cute today, like, let's see, like sparrows feeding their young with worms, or goslings running around with really long legs that look too long for their bodies, young children walking by in ceremonial court costume, trying very carefully to look regal and elegant as they walk, things like that.
I like the detail. I'm not sure if this was from her book or a similar one that you mentioned, but of children when they wear sleeves that are too long. That's like
Yes.
a that's like an inherently cute thing, and it just is. And you read it as a modern reader, and you smile because it just it taps into something that seems to be quite timeless.
Yeah, which is quite amazing considering it was written 1,000 years ago and life was so different then.
So one of the things that you really draw out is the differences between as I'm sure we'll get on to, there is now a Western passion for cuteness, but the Japanese interest in it emerges much earlier than in Europe. So at this same period 1,000 years ago, when the Pillow Book is being written, talk to me about the European attitude towards cuteness, and particularly the European attitude towards children, because that's very interesting.
Yeah, one really leads from the other, I think. Well, children and animals. Those are the things that kind of indicate where cuteness is in a society. So 1,000 years ago in Europe, well, I don't want to get my dates wrong, but just generally speaking, like long ago in Europe, there were a couple of different ways of looking at raising children. And one of them was the doctrine of original sin. That's not the way that everyone raised their children, but it was a strong influence. But I think we can also say at that time that because of really high child mortality rates, which is really unfortunate and very tough on parents, of course, even tougher on children, the parents were really worried about their children going to hell. And so they tried to instill a sense of moral responsibility, sense of right and wrong at a very early age. And that made many parents quite strict with discipline. And it was quite different in Japan. So we have that kind of thing going on in the West. It's just a kind of a concern for the immortal souls of children that we don't find in countries like Japan.
There's this famous essay, isn't there? Book. I've forgotten the name of the author for a second. The Invention of Childhood. This idea that we didn't really have in Europe an idea of, certainly not an idea of the child, the teenager, the adult. That children kind of entered the adult world when they were like 7, and that's when they start being economically productive and so on. And yes, that the European attitude towards children in general, and particularly post 7, is very unsentimental. Lots of corporal punishment.
Many children were sent out to work. Yeah, that's true. There's been a little bit of pushback on his ideas because he really
Mm-hmm.
said that there was no concept of childhood at all
Mm-hmm.
back then. But since then, historians of childhood have pointed to evidence like journals, private journals, and letters. And there we can find people who write with great affection of their children. So we know that people did appreciate the antics of children at that time, but they never put it into serious literature because of this like religious thing that treated the raising of children with a lot of moral seriousness. And another interesting thing was that people at that time really didn't want their children to be compared to animals Like for a time in Europe, they didn't even like to see children crawl because animals crawled on the ground. So they,
It's so
they
strange.
stopped their children from crawling, which is probably not food for development. And
They
I think
wanted bum shufflers rather than crawlers.
there you go. So they didn't think that children should be amusing. That was the job of like domesticated animals or monkeys or something. I actually said that at the time. Like, if you are amused by your children, it's like treating them like monkeys. And it wasn't until people really were able to enjoy and be entertained by their children guilt-free until the rise of cuteness really took hold in the West. And that wasn't until the very late 19th century and early 20th century. It took a long time.
You do see, if you're looking at, sticking with Europe for the time being, if you look at paintings from the period, I mean, one of the weird things that you'll see is really ugly Christ childs. I was told by my art history teacher at school that this was because it was felt to be somehow offensive to portray the Christ child as being really like a baby. So he's made to look like a miniature adult, which is obviously very uncanny and quite unpleasant. So these are medieval paintings. But you do see post-Renaissance, the gorgeous cherubs and the kind of the chubby. So you start to see cute depictions of little children earlier than the 19th century, right?
Yes, that's right. Although even the cherubs and putti of the Renaissance, they were more beautiful than cute. They were, remember, cherubs are like angels, so they're closer to God. They're not human. And they have a kind of knowledge, the knowledge of the, I'm sorry, I don't know much about Christianity actually, but the knowledge of of Christ's fate, for example. So cherubs tend to be playful, but also they're serious in a way as well. And also, I was going to mention that when children appear in paintings in the medieval period, they are posed very stiffly and awkwardly and really do look more like adults. And I think one reason for that was that only really wealthy families could afford to have their children painted. And they wanted to show that their family line would continue into the future. There's a really high rate of child mortality. So by picturing their children as kind of older and ready to take the reins of the family, they're showing their family line will continue.
Interesting. And then you have, in the 19th century, you have the emergence in the West of the cuteness ideal. Why do you think that Japan acquired it earlier? Because Japan also presumably had high infant mortality and child mortality, because everyone did really in the pre-modern period. But then you write about there are also other long-standing Japanese interests, like interests in miniature and in transients, like the cherry blossom
Mm-hmm.
is partly beautiful because it's fleeting. So are there other things, do you think, feeding into, in the cultural history of Japan, feeding into cuteness?
Yeah, several things. As you said, this appreciation of perishability, of things that bloom and then fade away quickly, like cherry blossoms. There's also the fact that Japan was a Buddhist country, and so they believed in reincarnation. And it's kind of interesting. But one of my students wrote an essay once where she said that when she was young, a young child, her baby sister died, and she was really, of course, really sad about it. But then her mother had another child sometime later, and her grandmother pointed at the newborn and said, "Do you see that mole on her heel? That's the same place that your other sister had a mole. So this is her soul reborn in a new body." And my student wrote that she didn't really know if she believed in that as an adult, but she did remember that it was of great comfort to her when she was a child. And back then in Japan, people really did believe in that. So that was a reason, I think, that they didn't feel the need to discipline their children so harshly.
I am normally, regular listeners will know, a sort of brutal materialist when it comes to explaining historical and anthropological differences. But this is one of those. So you'd be tempted to look, therefore, at European history and attitudes towards children and see, well, of course, it's because of high child mortality. But actually, the Japanese example does suggest that that's not the only thing. Like maybe there might be other material factors that we don't know about, but there does seem to be something ideological as well. And maybe it comes down to religion. Yes, this original sin versus reincarnation maybe just gives people a different attitude towards little children.
I think it's a partial explanation. And then there are those other really long-standing aesthetic values that we were talking about, like an appreciation of the perishable, which has been called the most distinctively Japanese aesthetic ideal. Because in Western art, that wasn't really appreciated so much. blossoming of cherry blossoms, or the like sort of temporary but irresistible cuteness of children and young animals.
I think you mentioned at one point that Japan had a long period of peace during a period where Europe was far more war torn. Do you think maybe that plays into as well some of these aesthetic interests?
Yeah, I mean, this is also speculation, but the two time periods where cuteness really established a presence in the arts in Japan were both long periods of peace. One of them was in the Heian period, 1,000 years ago. There were hundreds of years of relative peace in Japan. And then they fell into this long civil war period that was also lasted hundreds of years. And then after that was the Edo period from 1603 until the 19th century. And that was also a peaceful period. And the cuteness really flourished in the arts in the Edo period with printmaking and painting, and puppies were painted on fans and all kinds of like, not ephemeral, but sort of whimsical things.
Yes, you reproduce some of these images from, say, the fans, 18th century fans, and they're so modern, these
Aren't
images
they?
of the cute puppies. Yeah, they're so striking. And I guess because what it's revealing is that we in the West have developed this cuteness passion relatively late, and that's why it looks modern to us to see the cuteness portrayed in a much older era.
Yeah, you're talking about a puppy that was done in an outline drawing with a really reduced amount of detail, like just enough detail to show us that puppy energy and cuteness. And those values in the arts of minimalism, appreciation of minimalism, and reduction of detail, those came to the West from Japan in the 19th century. So you can also say that modernism developed in the West under the influence of Japanese art. You can absolutely say that. And although cuteness wasn't really prevalent in like the 1860s when this began, in the 1880s, 1890s, that's when cuteness rose up in Japan. And that's when all of these Japanese aesthetic values had kind of filtered down to ordinary consumers.
Do you think that Japanese influence was present in some of the? I'm thinking of some of the late Victorian things like Pear's soap ads using cherubic little children. Do you think that Japan had an influence there, or do you think it was a separate cultural development?
That's really hard to say. I think the influence was mostly in the background because every artist at that time knew about Japanese art, every single one. But that didn't mean that they directly influenced everything that they did. And there were other reasons for that rise of the image of children in advertising starting in the very early 20th century. I mean, the 20th century was called the century of the child. And it was called that in 1900, just when it began. And there are several reasons for that. Social reasons, like infant mortality finally going down. And also parents realizing the importance of education in an industrialized society. And there are also technological reasons, mass production and introduction of photography and later color lithography for printing images in color, and celluloid molding, like early plastic objects like the Cupid doll. So these kinds of things all coalesced in the very late 19th, early 20th century. And that's when cuteness really rose up in the West.
Yes, and that's when you get figures like Bubbles and British advertising, and then Shirley Temple later on. I liked all these. I don't know if like just the right word. I was interested in all these details about how Shirley Temple was portrayed, was made to look more neotenous on screen. So things like her curls make her head look bigger. She was deliberately made to look shorter by casting tall actors alongside her and things like that. So they're like playing up the babyishness as much as they possibly can for a child actress who's actually getting older and older.
Yeah, and when she hit about 12, she just stopped making films. So her popularity was extremely high. I mean, she was the most popular actress in the world for like 3 or 4 years. And that was it.
One of the big questions that you wrestle with in the book, right, is why it is that cuteness seems to have this timeless quality. Why we can read lists of adorable things from 1,000 years ago and feel that same emotional response. Talk about the domestication syndrome theory as to why there are some elements that seem to be have enduring appeal.
Well, there are two aspects to feeling cuteness, and one of them seems to be biological. It's just hardwired into our brains and encoded in our DNA. And the reason for that is that human children need a lot of care and attention and also socialization. I think it's really interesting. I'm going off your topic a little bit, but I think it's really interesting that peak cuteness in human children, according to lots of studies, happens at about 5 or 6 months. And that's just the age where children are becoming more aware of the world around them and are able to see other people as separate entities and different agents, different than themselves, and can make social connections. And cuteness works not only for one's own children, but also for other people's children. So if you see a baby being walked in a stroller and you smile at the baby and it smiles back, you're sending a message to that child that strangers can be trusted. Maybe that's too extreme, but that the world can be an open place that can be supportive. And I think that's a really important lesson for children to learn when they're very young. Cuteness helps us to teach it to them. So that's the biological aspect behind it. And the other aspect is just the aesthetic aspect. So cuteness rises up in the arts and in mass culture in different times and in different places, like we've discussed before. But you also mentioned the domestication syndrome. Okay, so I don't want to get too far in the weeds here, and this is only a hypothesis, but we know that dogs, cats, horses, cows, like all kinds of domesticated animals, including rabbits, etc., they share a common set of characteristics. The first of which is that they are tameable. They're friendly, but also physical characteristics, like they look more neotenous than their wild counterparts. They look more juvenile in their appearance, even as they get older. So they have like bigger heads and smaller jaws and smaller teeth and shorter arms and legs, things like that. So I'm thinking about the difference between dogs and wolves, for example. There's a theory that humans are also a self-domesticated species. If it's true, it meant that over a really long period of time in our evolutionary past, we probably preferred to mate with individuals that were more friendly and less violent. Now, it's kind of hard to see that because we are still a really violent species, right? But if you compare us to, say, chimpanzees, which are our closest primate relatives, the levels of violence in chimpanzee communities are many times higher than in any human community. So the one reason I like this theory of self-domestication is that it really gives women much more agency in the history of our species, because it says that women were choosing kinder, gentler men as mates, preferring to mate with men who wouldn't beat them up. And over many, many thousands, tens of thousands of years, that changed our whole species to make us more like domesticated dogs or cats. What do you think?
Richard Wrangham also has this alternative theory. So is Richard Wrangham I'm not sure if he coined the domestication syndrome as an idea, but he's one of the key evolution anthropologists in this. And he also has this idea that we self-domesticated because we developed language, and then kind of beta males would use language to gang up on super aggressive alpha males and assassinate them, essentially. So that's I know this is contested, but these are the kind of different theories available for why we seem to have become domesticated as a species.
Yeah, he leaves out women entirely from that story. He thinks it's all about men ganging up on alpha males. But even in chimpanzee communities, the alpha male is rarely acting completely alone. It's rarely like a tyrant. Instead, alpha males usually have coalitions, and that's how they retain their top space. Otherwise, the other males would do just that. They gang up on the alpha and kill them, and then one of them would take his place. So I don't think it's the whole story.
They're not necessarily mutually exclusive as well. The thing that is so interesting about domestication syndrome is that my embryology is very rusty, okay, but my understanding is that it's something to do with the development of the neural crest. And when the neural crest is adjusted in this way to make a creature, including a person, less reactively aggressive, more playful, all these kind of personality traits that we associated with, say, domestic dogs versus wolves, it also brings some curious physical characteristics.
Exactly. Yes.
And this seems to be a bundle. And it doesn't seem that you can really separate them out. So things like having floppy ears, this doesn't apply to humans, obviously, but having floppy ears, you start domesticating, say, Arctic foxes that you write about, and the foxes get one, more tame and happy to play with humans, but two, they get floppy ears because that's just part of the syndrome. It's part of the package.
Yeah, exactly. So the neural crest is embryonic structure, so it's in embryos of mammals, and it's where the spine is going to be later. And the neural crest is sends out cells to different parts of the body and telling it how to develop. So what scientists have found is that if there is a delay in the migration of those cells, then you get a whole suite of changes like the ones you were talking about, which are partially behavioral, like the fight or flight reflex is dampened, less adrenal response in animals that had a delayed migration of neurocrest cells, and also these physical characteristics like white patches on the face and tail of animals,
Mm.
floppy ears and smaller teeth and smaller jaws, and the other aspects of the domestication syndrome.
Shorter faces.
Sort
Basically,
of face.
you look more like a baby.
And rounder heads too, yeah. Yeah,
Right.
they're all
Yeah.
neotenous characteristics. And humans are the most neotenous of mammals, so it could be a connection.
Which seems weird because we are also in some ways very violent. But the
Hmm.
distinction that Wrangham makes, which I think is a useful one in general, is between reactive aggression. So the example that he gives is you could never put hundreds of chimpanzees on a 747 and expect to fly safely across the Atlantic because they would just tear each other's heads off. Like they can't cope with that level of sort of impulse control. Whereas humans, we do that quite happily. But we also create nuclear weapons. So so we can be proactively aggressive, I think is the expression, meaning that we get together with other humans and we plan extraordinary aggression, but we are low in reactive aggression, which is the kind of the hair trigger, what are you looking at, Larry guy in the pub aggression. Obviously we have a bit of it, but we don't have anywhere near as much as, say, chimpanzees.
Yeah, that's the theory. And the neurocrest is the hypothesis that links everything together, links the behavioral changes of lowered aggression with the physical changes of having a neotenous, cuter looking body.
Many of you will know that Christianity is a subject of fascination for me, and the role of Christianity in shaping the modern world is a theme I return to again and again on the podcast. My view is that we really can't understand the world or ourselves without getting to grips with it, which is why I'm very glad to point you towards a new online course called 321. It's an introduction to Christianity that's imaginative, thoughtful, engaging. It assumes absolutely no prior knowledge. It's presented by the wonderful Glenn Scrivener, who has been a guest on the MMM podcast previously, and I've also been a guest on his show. Glenn presents 8 video-led sessions which are based around some beautiful animated stories that illustrate the Christian message. You can check it out for free at 321course.com/MMM. Just enter your email, choose a password, and you're in. There's no spam, there's no fees. Just visit 321course.com/MMM. And now onto the show.
Right. So this brings us back to cuteness. We've developed this interest in all of these physical traits. So things like thinking about Shirley Temple. She's got the big cheeks. She's got the kind of almost bulbous head. I mean, if you think of a human child's head compared with like a Neanderthal adult's head,
Right.
it's quite a different shape. A Neanderthal adult has quite a long face.
That's right.
Whereas a baby looks almost like a balloon.
Even human adults have those differences compared to Neanderthal adults. Yeah.
Right, because of the domestication syndrome theory.
Hmm.
And Shirley Temple, she's got big eyes, she's got a little nose, talk me through all the physical characteristics of cuteness, which our eyes are light upon.
Yeah, also kind of bulging cheeks and short arms and legs. And the ones that you mentioned, like large face, small nose. Yes. So these are all the baby-like characteristics that we have a reaction to in our brains. Like they've done MRI studies, stuck people in MRI machines and show them cute images and measure what happened to their brains. And what happens first is that the cute things attract our attention very quickly, and then the reward and pleasure areas of our brains light up.
Are we because we're already quite neotenous, are our young more neotenous than other species young?
That's a really interesting question. I would say no, because it's the human adults that are really neotenous. That's the kind of strange thing.
Oh, it's more
Although
that we
in
cling on
general,
to it.
domesticated,
Okay.
there's less of if you take wild animals like wolves, baby wolves are really, really cute in a similar way to the way dogs are and a similar way to the way human babies are. But adult wolves look really different. They just change a lot as they grow older. But for dogs and humans, we don't change as much. we retain these neotenous juvenile characteristics into adulthood.
Interesting. Okay, so we start at the same place in terms of neoteny, but then we hold on to these physical and personality characteristics more than other species do. I mean, some adult dogs look ridiculously juvenile. I mean, and
That's so cool.
that's kind of the point of like pugs, right? That they are,
Yeah, they
that
were
they are
bred that way
designed.
deliberately much later. Yeah.
These little lap dogs. Can I tell you, I went to the hairdressers at the weekend and there was a lady there who had a little dachshund on her lap, who was actually an adult dachshund, who was sitting in her handbag while she had her hair done. And after she left, she went out into the street and I heard, like within seconds, she encountered some women who she didn't know, who were just passing by, who went bananas about this dog. You could hear the squealing, from inside the hairdressers. And it's because dachshunds really are... They've got short little legs, very Shirley Temple. They're very docile. Their ears are very floppy. They don't quite have... Dachshunds don't have the kind of enormous eyes and stuff that some other lapdogs do. But they're hitting all of those baby senses.
Yeah, you don't have to have them all. If a creature has just several of them, then it just screams baby to our brain, and then we react.
Yeah, it can be to the poor dog's detriment sometimes, because things like the dogs, some dogs have eyes, like Boston Terriers and pugs, have eyes now that are so big that it actually causes them serious physical problems because they've been bred to be so babyish.
Or the flat-faced dogs that have breathing difficulties because they've been
Yeah,
bred to look so cute. Yeah, that's
yeah,
it's part of the dark side of cuteness. It has a dark
yeah,
side.
yeah. So going back to Japanese culture of cuteness, how where do we see these characteristics playing out in someone like something like Hello Kitty?
Yeah, I mean, Hello Kitty has those same kind of characteristics. Like, kind of Hello Kitty is kind of the minimal amount of information it will take to trigger that cuteness response. So no mouth at all, but big wide face and pretty big eyes, and just enough to trigger the cuteness impulse, but to trigger it quite strongly for her fans.
Yeah, so she's got a stubby little body. She's got an enormous bulbous head. She's got enormous eyes. But yeah, curious, no mouth. That's quite funny. And that's quite common in a lot of these cute figurines to not have a mouth.
I think it aids in projection. I mean, with that minimal kind of detail, then you can imagine whatever you want the cute object is feeling. So you can project your own feelings onto Hello Kitty, and that increases the appeal. It's interesting because I'm talking about, us projecting onto something else, but the point is that we're imagining that thing feeling something, and it's that relationship, even though it's imaginary, that triggers a stronger cuteness response.
Yes, it's odd, isn't it, that we don't want... This is also true of Pikachu. Was it Pikachu that you mentioned? I can't remember. One particular cute character which has this kind of funny triangle mouth and actually isn't really smiling. Like there's a real emotional ambiguity.
A friend of mine said it looked like a baby bird's mouth open, ready to be fed.
Yeah, funny, huh? Because you might expect a sort of big, broad baby smile to be the most attractive thing, but it seems not.
Well, smiles have been linked to cuteness in studies, so we do tend to think that smiles are cute. But as I said before, with cute design, if you load every single cute feature onto every single cute design, people will just get tired of it. They'll get inured to it. So you need some differences to mix it up to keep people stimulated. So that's what the designers are always trying to do.
That's very interesting. And these are, of course, characters that have sort of been selected by the market for being maximally popular. So they're doing something right.
Yeah, like Mickey Mouse, it's kind of well known that Mickey Mouse's design became younger as the decades went on. And that's not because Disney designers had read scientific research. They were responding to what the public wanted. And what they wanted was a baby-looking mouse. And that's what they got.
Yes, it's really curious that these characters that had existed for 100 years or more, they become cuter over time. Do you think that the public just develop more of a taste for it and they kind of double down on it?
Yeah, that's a good question. Maybe it's hard to answer completely, but actually in modern times, I'd say after the last 100 years, just in general, a lot of characters from folklore have gotten cuter too. I mean, younger looking. So we tended to just sort of as mass culture developed and mass production developed, we just sort of more and more became oriented towards younger and younger looking characters. And in more recent times, we've seen adults that are indulging more in childlike behavior and pastimes, playing games as adults, like this game pickleball is now very popular in the United States. Used to be kind of a children's game. So our culture in general seems to be swinging towards these more youthful behaviors over time.
Yes, it's curious, isn't it? And this is, of course, true in the West as well. But it seems to be more marked in Japan. There's more of not just the culture of cuteness, but the culture of youth, which is connected to it. It's really, really marked, particularly among women's culture.
Yeah, modern day kawaii, Japanese cuteness, really rose up among women's culture in the 1970s. And then it began spreading to the culture at large starting in the 80s, and then really became entrenched in Japanese culture in the 90s, and then just has gone on from there.
And it comes along with the fashion as well. So lots of listeners will be familiar with the Lolita fashion culture, but that's a subset of the kawaii culture, right?
Yeah, very much a subset. It actually does trace its roots back to the 1970s. It goes back further than a lot of people know. But Lolita fashion was quite a strong subculture in Japan. It's losing its hold a little bit in Japan now. It's not as popular as it was before, but now it's become really popular in places like mainland China. Lolita fashion it's still a subculture, but there are lots of fashion brands in China, Chinese Lolita fashion brands now.
Describe what the look is for anyone who's not seen it before. How is it? How does the cuteness play into it?
Well, the first thing I have to say about Lolita fashion is that it's really misnamed. It has nothing to do with Nabokov's novel Lolita. That it's named that because the novel was popular in Japan and the word Lolita came into the Japanese language, like used as Lolita, to mean a young girl. It didn't carry the kind of sexual baggage that it does in the West. So when it was adopted by young women to describe this fashion style that was really cute, they used it not knowing about the adult novel. So the style is a kind of like a mix of French Rococo and British Victorian. It's very girly and feminine, and at least the traditional Lolita styles were very modest as well. They didn't show much skin. They wore gloves and they wore wigs and they wore stockings and long dresses and things like that.
And lots of lace and frills, and it is a bit Shirley Temple.
Very much, yes. Yeah, it's the whole point is over the top cuteness. There are some kind of restrained styles of it, but only relatively. Basically, it's all cute overload.
Shirley Temple meets Marie Antoinette. You also mentioned this book. What's it called? The very famous, successful very long manga novel about Marie Antoinette.
Oh, The Rose of Versailles. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So there's also this subcultural interest in all things kind of French Rococo. You ever heard of Paris syndrome? Talking of syndromes, this isn't a serious one.
I don't think so.
It's supposedly the experience that Japanese tourists have when they actually go to Paris and they discover how filthy Paris is.
Oh, okay.
Because
and then become disillusioned?
Yes. Because the streetscapes of Japan are, of course, incredibly clean and orderly, and that's not true of Paris. So it's very disappointing for people who come from Japan. Anyway, so the Lolita fashion is a subset of Hawaii, but there's loads of other Pokemon, like all of these really, really successful Japanese cultural exports have a cuteness element to them, including kind of manga. I mean, manga has big eyes and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, as I said, it kind of developed in girls' culture in the 70s. And then it was through manga that it spread to young men as well, starting in the 70s, but really getting it up to speed in the 80s. And one of the reasons was manga by that same author, Ryoko Ikeda, who wrote Rose of Versailles. So Rose of Versailles is a girls' manga. It's a romantic tale. It's very full of frilly details, ribbons and frills. But she also wrote some quite serious science fiction works that are really, really good. And in the 1970s, a lot of male university students who had formed manga appreciation clubs discovered her work, which they had never read before because they didn't read girls' manga, but they really loved it. And that kind of sparked the boom of men reading girls' manga as well as boys' manga. And then in the 80s, the two kind of come together. And in the 90s, you get properties like Sailor Moon, magical girl manga and then anime, which became popular all over the world.
Just thinking about the manga physical image of a person, the whites of the eyes are a very striking feature of the manga face. Tell me again about the going back to the Nilton's look. Whites of the eyes seems to be a big one. You also think of something like Tweety Bird, the Looney Tunes character, Mickey Mouse. Like a classic thing is massive eyes, but not just massive eyes, massive whites of the eyes. Why do you think that's appealing to us?
Well, one reason is that although a lot of animals have whites in their eyes, you can't really see them. Like dogs or cats, the color of their eyes covers their entire eyeball. But humans have this huge amount of white on our eyes compared to other animals. And it was not selected for in nature in other animals because it's dangerous. You signal your presence through eyes. They're so noticeable. Even predators don't have white eyes because their prey would notice it, or other predators. But somehow we have them. So we can see from that, or it's hypothesized anyway, that this thing that scientists call eye signaling, the ability to signal with our eyes, was really important in our evolution. So in other words, communication was so important for us as a species that it trumped this weakness in that it allowed predators to see us more easily. And so when we see a cartoon character with big white eyes, it immediately signals human to us. And that's the reason why so many characters are given it. And then in manga, the large white eyes were started by by the most famous manga artist, Tezuka Osama, who did Astro Boy and properties like that. And he was working on manga were published in quite small books, little small panels, small drawings. So he said that if he made the eyes larger, he could show more emotion in his characters. And it's true. He really hit on something. So that's the origin of big white eyes in manga characters and also of cartoon characters in general.
I was just thinking about dogs again. Sometimes pugs have, you can see the whites of their eyes. So, we have a German Shepherd cross, so he's like a real dog's dog, right? And he doesn't he doesn't have any Kinshashiма whatsoever. He looks like a wolf, and his eyes there are no whites of his eyes whatsoever, and actually his eyes are kind of orange, so they don't look human at all. I think he does signal. He looks more, because he's a domesticated dog and not actually a wolf. He does things that wolves don't do. Like I've never met wolves. I've met dingoes in some Australian zoos. You can go and meet dingoes because they're safe. And the weird thing about them is that they don't look you in the eye, and they don't do lots of doggy things that we're used to dogs doing, even though they look like dogs. Whereas our dog, being a domesticated dog, he does all of that. He looks right in your eyes, and he's very kind of human receptive and whatever, but he doesn't have any of that neotness stuff because it's not been bred into him. Whereas the pugs, for instance, some of them, they've been bred to look babyish, and they you can sometimes see the whites of their eyes because their eyes are so enormous, and
Right.
it kind of gives me the creeps
Mhm.
sometimes. But I don't know if
Yeah.
that's just me. But I do think that there sometimes is a creepy element of like hyper cuteness. Like Hello Kitty, she can be a bit creepy and a bit sinister and scary, don't you think? Like sometimes cuteness can flip over into being more sinister.
Yeah, there are many examples of that, and ultimately it depends on personal preference, because as we know, there are plenty of people who love pugs and Hello Kitty. But the way I think of it is cuteness, because when it works, it creates this physical response in us and physiological response. So it is a quality that blends easily with other qualities, even ones that seem to be quite different, like creepiness. So you can take something that's really creepy, and if you add some cute characteristics to it, if you can just ride the line, then you're going to reach a point where some people will go, "Ooh, that's creepy," and other people will go, "Oh, how cute." And designers love doing that, and artists love doing that even more. Artists tend to go on the creepy side. Designers tend to go on the cuter side. But that's kind of part of the fun of studying and also experiencing cuteness, is that we can have different opinions about it, and it sparks endless discussions and different feelings in us.
Do you think there might be an uncanny valley element as well? Because if what we're trying to do with all of these things, the pugs, the Hello Kitties, is imitate human babies, except that they're not really, of course, human babies. Do you think sometimes they're like, the uncanny valley idea that in robotics, where something looks completely like a robot, no problem, looks completely like a person, no problem, but there's a kind of horrible middle ground where something's not quite right, and that induces this feeling of horror. Do you think sometimes we get that with the cute things as well?
Yeah, sure. I do think so. And I think it is often attached to eyes as well. So eyes that took, if you can imagine it just like a cute object, but if it has disturbingly human looking eyes, that might creep us out a bit. And I think that's one reason why designers really tend to go for a more minimalist look, because they don't want to trigger that kind of quality. Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah, because yes, one of the really notable features about Pikachu and Hello Kitty is that they're composed of like half a dozen lines or something, and a couple of colors. They're about as simple as you can get as an image.
Yeah, and they do just enough to trigger that cuteness response. And it's not a really, I mean, we've been talking about it as if it's a set formula, but those are really just guiding principles. I mean, if we could really exactly tell what was going to be cute, then AI would be like churning it out at 10,000 designs a second. But actually, it takes humans to really know what's cute and what's not. And even professional designers often don't know until they've done several iterations of a design and then can just look at one of them and go, that one, that's the cute one. That's what happened with Hello Kitty.
Interesting. And I guess they respond to the market as well. You see what people like, and whatever they like gets fed back to them in this kind of discourse.
Of course, yes.
And maybe as well our liking for it is exaggerated over time as well, because of this funny process you describe where, say, Mickey Mouse becomes more nuanced over time. So we're kind of feeding into it more and more and more. I guess one of the... I think it's probably fair to say that women like the cuteness more than men do, right?
According to studies, yeah, both men and women like cuteness, but when women tend to have slightly higher responses. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And so one of the things maybe we're seeing in, say, Japanese culture, really doubling down on the cuteness aesthetic, is women having more influence in mass culture, it being a more kind of feminized mass culture.
Yeah, I think so. Started when we can probably date that to the 80s. Japan's economy was really booming then, but it was still quite a traditional society in terms of gender roles. So one thing that happened was women married quite young, usually mid-20s. So they would get out of university and they get a job at a company and they work for several years, and then usually most of them would get married. So they tended to regard that time period of several years when they were working and earning income, but usually living at home. That was a time of great freedom for them, and they were willing to spend everything they made because they thought, well, I'm probably going to have to get married sooner or later. So they became kind of the archetypal consumer in Japanese society, and companies started to sell more and more towards, targeting women, and especially young women, as their customers, because they were the ones who were freely spent their money. And over time, the whole consumer culture sort of like swung around to think of women as the archetypal consumers. And that was firmly in place by the 90s.
And this happens, I guess, at the same time as this amazing economic boom in Japan, which is now leveled off because of Japanese low fertility and so on. But is that kind of the key thing, do you think, in terms of you have an economic boom, you have women entering the labour market, earning their own money, wanting to buy this stuff, it's kind of feeding onto feminine preferences in terms of consumption?
It was a factor during the bubble economy in the 70s and 80s. But then the bubble economy crashed in the 90s, early 90s, 91. So suddenly nobody had any money anymore. But by that time, the cuteness was really quite firmly established in the mass popular culture in Japan. And what became really interesting then was that once people didn't have all this money to buy designer fashion and things like that, they started to put together their own fashion looks, and sometimes buying used clothing, which people would never have done during the bubble economy when everybody's salary was like doubling every 5 years. I'm exaggerating, but only a little. In the 90s, they really discovered used shops and styling their own looks. And that's when street fashion really rose up in Japan. We had these like fashion tribes coming into being, where people would meet each other and maybe they liked the same kind of music. And they started to dress in a similar way and go out together. And that was really the heyday of Japanese fashion in my eyes, was the 1990s street fashion era.
The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.